She was 18. She had just moved into a student dormitory in Amsterdam. A bicycle, a meal card, a roommate she hadn't met yet. And then, in the span of one intelligence briefing, everything she had waited her whole life to experience was taken from her. Not by royal protocol, by a criminal network with axes and a kill list. The question is not whether she was in danger. The question is what they stole and whether any of it comes back. There is a photograph most people never saw. It was taken in September of 2021. On the first day, Catharina-Amalia moved into her student accommodation in Amsterdam. She is carrying something ordinary, a bag, a box, the kind of object that marks the beginning of something new. Her security detail stands nearby, as they always do. But in this moment, at this particular staircase, she could almost pass for any other first-year student figuring out how much her new life is going to weigh. That moment lasted less than 6 weeks. Not because the palace changed its mind, not because she failed an exam or decided the experiment wasn't for her, because Dutch intelligence intercepted a set of communications. Because a criminal network, one with a documented history of executing lawyers on residential streets and shooting journalists in front of television studios in broad daylight, had begun discussing her name alongside discussions of kidnapping, of assassination. This is where the story of Princess Catharina-Amalia has to begin. Not in a throne room, not at a coronation, but at a dormitory door she walked through once and was not permitted to walk back through again. She was born on the 7th of December, 2003, the first child of King Willem-Alexander and Queen Maxima. By birth and by the Dutch constitution, she is the Princess of Orange, heir to one of Europe's oldest continuous constitutional monarchies. The role was not offered to her. It was assigned before she had drawn her first breath, and yet, for nearly 3 years, through what should have been the most formative months of her adult life, the future queen could not safely walk to a cafe in the capital city she is constitutionally destined to one day govern. Could not take a tram across Amsterdam. Could not step outside without armed guards and security assessments and walls she was not permitted to leave behind. What does it mean when a crown becomes a cage? What does it tell us about power, the kind that can protect an institution across 2 centuries when it cannot protect the 18-year-old girl it has chosen to carry its future? And why, for as long as it was possible, did the people responsible for both the crown and the girl try to keep those questions from being asked at all? By May of 2026, a courtroom in The Hague began to provide answers. They were partial answers. They were disturbing ones, but they were real. To understand what that courtroom revealed, you have to go back. Back to Amsterdam, back to 2021, and back to everything that was already waiting for her there. To understand what was stolen, you have to first understand what was being built. The Dutch monarchy has never been the most theatrical of Europe's royal institutions. There is no Versailles in The Hague, no crown jewel rivalry with Buckingham Palace. The House of Orange-Nassau has survived across centuries in part by making a specific and deliberate choice to be present rather than remote, accessible rather than decorative. The image the Dutch royal family has cultivated across generations is not one of divine distance. It is one of managed proximity. These people are of us, they just happen to carry a crown. Catharina-Amalia was raised entirely inside that tradition. From her earliest public appearances, the picture offered to the Dutch was of a family that valued contact over ceremony. King Willem-Alexander had spent years working in water management and aviation before ascending in 2013, a king who had held an ordinary job. Queen Maxima had arrived in the Netherlands in the late 1990s as a young Argentine woman with no royal background, built a life in finance, and married into the dynasty. She brought with her an outsider's clarity about what the institution needed to be in a modern democracy. The Dutch press, which can be unsparing, had largely come to respect both of them, not with the reverence one gives a distant symbol, but with the more durable approval one gives a neighbour who does the job well. Their eldest daughter seemed, from adolescence, to be following the same logic. She studied at the Christelijk Gymnasium Zorgvliet in The Hague, a rigorous school, but not a sequestered one. She sat the standard VWO examinations alongside students with no palace connection. She earned the diploma. When she spoke in public, which she did carefully and rarely, she chose words that emphasized learning, usefulness, and curiosity, not entitlement, not performance. When she turned 18 in December of 2021 and formally received the title Princess of Orange, she made a decision that drew significant attention across the Netherlands. She declined the annual parliamentary allowance to which she was legally entitled, a sum exceeding €1 million per year, stating she would not accept it until she had completed her university education. The gesture was noted. In a country that takes democratic accountability seriously, it was received as something more than symbolic. She enrolled at the University of Amsterdam to study political science and international law, the same institution her father had attended. She chose to live in student housing in the city rather than in a private apartment or a royal residence. She had, by all available accounts, genuinely intended to live among her peers, not above them. The Dutch, broadly, approved. Here was a future queen doing something difficult, choosing exposure to ordinary life while knowing, with complete clarity, that the ordinary life was not and could never be fully available to her. The effort was visible, the intention was read as genuine. The story felt real, because it was real, as far as it went. What the public did not know, and could not know, because no one with authority had chosen to say, it was that by the time she walked through that dormitory door, a conversation had already begun about whether she could safely stay. There is a particular kind of pressure that comes with being the first of anything, and Catharina-Amalia was, in several senses, a first. She was the first heir to the Dutch throne, to grow up entirely in the era of smartphones and social media, in a world where every public appearance generated hundreds of thousands of searchable images within hours. She was the first princess in the Orange-Nassau line to attend a mainstream school where students carried phones and could photograph her at lunch if they chose. She was being asked to perform a kind of normalcy that the institution she was embedded in had never been designed to actually accommodate. And she seemed, from early on, to understand this precisely. In a rare extended interview conducted when she was 17, she spoke with a specificity that stood apart from standard royal public statements. She described the pull of two identities: the constitutional heir who had been prepared since childhood, and the person who still needed to discover who she actually was. She spoke about her mother's experience as a newcomer to the Netherlands, arriving without the automatic cultural fluency that heritage provides, as something she thought about often, as a reminder that identity is not fixed, that where you are going and who you are do not have to be decided by where you started. She spoke about wanting to travel without a motorcade, to ask questions in places that policy briefings never reach, to understand the country she would one day represent from something closer to the inside. What struck observers was not the content of these statements. Many heirs to constitutional thrones say similar things. What struck them was the apparent seriousness with which she had already sat with the gap between the role and the reality, and chosen to think about it honestly rather than manage it publicly. Queen Maxima had navigated her own version of this gap. She had arrived in the Netherlands as an adult with a fully formed sense of self, a career in finance, an Argentine identity, a life built on her own terms before the crown arrived to reorganize everything. Watching her daughter prepare for what she herself had been handed, Maxima had said in various interviews across the years that the experience was both a source of pride and something more complicated. You watch your child prepare to carry something you know the full weight of, and you cannot carry it for her. Willem-Alexander carried his own version of the knowledge. He was the son of Queen Beatrix, the grandson of Queen Juliana, the great-grandson of Queen Wilhelmina. He had watched the crown pass through 4 consecutive generations before arriving at him. He had spent decades being prepared, then waiting, then finally ascending to the throne in 2013 at the age of 45. He understood in his body, not just in his head, what prolonged preparation does to a person. His daughter had grown up inside this understanding. She knew the timeline. She knew the weight. She also knew, it seems, that she had a narrow window, a few years at most, in which to become a person before the institution fully claimed her. The University of Amsterdam was that window. It was not naive idealism. It was a calculated attempt, approved and supported by the palace, to give the future queen genuine grounding in civic life before her public role consumed everything that remained. The plan was considered. The institution endorsed it. Nobody had factored in the networks that were already watching. The Netherlands, for all its civic warmth, has a specific and serious criminal problem. It did not emerge overnight. It grew across decades, embedded in the infrastructure of a country that functions as the largest cocaine entry point into continental Europe. The port of Rotterdam, the busiest in Europe, processes an extraordinary volume of legitimate trade. Embedded within that volume, beyond the reach of routine inspection, flows a narcotics economy worth tens of billions of euros per year. The organizations that control that economy have, over time, accumulated the resources and the willingness to use violence in ways that most Western European criminal enterprises stopped doing decades ago. They have a name: the Mokro Mafia, a loose federation of criminal networks rooted principally in Dutch Moroccan communities in Amsterdam and Rotterdam. The name is imprecise, a media term as much as a forensic one, but what it points to is real. A set of organizations with the capacity to order executions of specific named individuals in public places, to carry them out and to absorb the legal consequences without fracturing. 2 events. In the 2 years before Catharina-Amalia moved into student housing, established precisely what that capacity looked like. On the 18th of October, 2019, Dirk Wiersum was shot dead outside the front door of his own home in Amsterdam East. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. Wiersum was the defense lawyer for the key witness in the Marengo trial, the most significant organized crime prosecution in Dutch legal history. The killing was not random. It was a message delivered in a residential neighborhood, in daylight, to everyone involved in that case and every case like it. Then came the summer of 2021. On the 6th of July, 2021, weeks before Catharina-Amalia was scheduled to begin student life in Amsterdam, Peter R. de Vries stepped out of a television studio on the Lange Leidsevaarstraat and was shot in the head at close range. De Vries was one of the Netherlands' most prominent investigative journalists, a man who had spent more than 3 decades covering organized crime and who was himself serving as a confidential advisor to the same Crown witness that Wiersum had died protecting. De Vries was taken to hospital. He died 9 days later. The Netherlands had not experienced anything like it, not in living memory. This is the landscape into which the AIVD, the Dutch General Intelligence and Security Service, was operating in the autumn of 2021. It was in this landscape that they began intercepting communications from networks associated with the Mocro Mafia umbrella. And what those communications contained were not vague expressions of resentment toward the monarchy. They were specific. They discussed Catharina-Amalia directly. They discussed kidnapping. They discussed targeted violence. And alongside her name, they contained another. Mark Rutte, the Dutch Prime Minister. The AIVD did not hesitate. Within weeks of Amalia's arrival at the student accommodation in Amsterdam, she was gone. She was brought to Huis ten Bosch, the 19th century palace in The Hague that had served as the primary royal residence since 2019. The palace had always carried substantial security infrastructure. Now that infrastructure was reorganized around a different purpose. This was no longer about dignitary protection at public events. This was around-the-clock armed presence, perimeter management, a level of operational containment that transformed a residence into something that functioned more like a protected compound. The space that had once signified prestige now signified something closer to captivity. The public statement from the palace was minimal. Security arrangements had been reviewed and updated. The word threat appeared once. It was not repeated. Catharina-Amalia said nothing. Inside those walls, the question that was not yet being asked publicly was already fully present. How long could this last? And what would be left of the person it was protecting when it was over? For most of 2022, the Dutch public did not know where the Princess of Orange was. The palace maintained a presence at official events. King Willem-Alexander and Queen Maxima were photographed at state functions. The younger sisters, Alexia and Ariane, appeared at the occasional public engagement, but Catharina-Amalia herself had, in practical terms, withdrawn from Dutch public life. The explanation offered, when one was offered at all, referred to study commitments and scheduling. It was technically accurate. What it omitted was geography. Sometime in 2023, under circumstances that were not publicly disclosed, the Dutch royal household arranged for Catharina-Amalia to continue her university coursework from Madrid, Spain. She was housed in a private apartment near Parque del Retiro, the large public garden in the center of the Spanish capital, not far from the historic royal estate of El Pardo. Her courses were delivered remotely. Her contact with fellow students was minimal. Her movement outside the apartment was, by necessity, almost non-existent. This was not a gap year. This was not a diplomatic posting. This was the heir to the Dutch throne, living in a foreign country in conditions that were kept from the Dutch public because the Netherlands had assessed that it could not adequately guarantee her safety within its own borders. Official version: security measures were in place, and the princess's well-being and education were being appropriately managed. The palace did not volunteer additional detail. Suspected version: that the security situation was more severe and more prolonged than any official statement suggested, that the choice of Madrid reflected not a temporary precaution, but an acknowledgement that the threat environment in the Netherlands had not been neutralized. What Queen Maxima said when she finally addressed the situation directly did not align with the language of a temporary precaution. She said plainly, without diplomatic hedging, that her daughter could not leave the house. That this was not a minor disruption, that it had, in her own words, left major consequences for her daughter's life. It was among the most candid statements a member of the Dutch royal family had made in years, not because it was inflammatory, because it was specific, a mother describing something that had been done to her child, not a security briefing, not an institutional statement, a description of what living inside it actually felt like. Then Amalia herself spoke. In an interview conducted in 2024, she described what it was to be 20 years old and unable to walk down a public street. She said she missed normal life. She said she missed what a student's life is supposed to be. She said, and this is the sentence that stayed, she missed walking on the street, or just going into a shop. Going into a shop. A future queen, an heir to constitutional power. A young woman trained across her entire childhood to lead a modern democratic nation. And the thing she named, the thing she reached for when asked to describe what had been taken from her, was the freedom to go into a shop. The managed narrative, the one about security reviews and temporary precautions and appropriate arrangements, could not survive that sentence, not entirely. And then came May of 2026. A criminal court convened in The Hague to hear charges against a 33-year-old man referred to in proceedings as Anne Romke van der H, who had been arrested in February of that year. The prosecution laid out the evidence they had assembled, and what that evidence described was something that even experienced court reporters found difficult to sit with. The defendant had been operating under a fixed delusional conviction that he was in a romantic relationship with Princess Catharina-Amalia, that she had personally directed him to travel to Poland to complete a survival training mission on her behalf, that his actions, everything he had done, were sanctioned by her. When police searched his possessions, they found 2 axes. On the blades of those axes, the defendant had carved words and names. One blade carried the name Alexia, the princess's younger sister, then 19 years old. The same blade carried the word Mossad and the phrase Sieg Heil. Among his written materials, investigators found handwritten notes. The notes referenced both princesses by name. They contained the Dutch word bloedbad. It means bloodbath. Witnesses had observed the man standing on the balcony of his hotel, shouting at whoever would listen that he would kill them all. The courtroom in The Hague was very quiet. What the prosecution had presented was not a rational actor, not an agent of an organized network, something that is, in some ways, harder to contain, a person whose mind had constructed an entire private world around the image of the future Queen of the Netherlands, a world with its own internal logic, its own assigned roles, its own escalating demands, and who had armed himself accordingly. 2 axes, 2 names. 1 word for what he intended to do. After that day in court, there was no version of the story, no managed narrative, no careful press statement that could hold the same shape it had held before. At some point in every story like this, the facts stop being the hard part. The facts, in this case, are no longer seriously disputed. The threats were real. The evacuation from Amsterdam was necessary. The years of restriction were not a palace overreaction or a security apparatus behaving disproportionately. A man with carved weapons was arrested in early 2026, and a court in The Hague is in the process of determining what the law will do about what he intended. The harder question is not what happened. The harder question is what it means. And that question has been contested, not loudly, but persistently, since the moment the Dutch royal household first chose to keep the full weight of the situation from public knowledge. There is a position held by the palace and by the Dutch security services that non-disclosure was the only defensible choice. The argument runs as follows. Revealing the specifics of an active threat makes the target more accessible, not less. Operational details, once public, compromise the people working to prevent harm. A young woman already living under extraordinary restriction did not need her name attached, in every headline, to language about assassination plots and organized crime. Protecting the heir meant protecting the information around her. The institution, in this view, behaved responsibly. These are not unreasonable positions. They are the positions that intelligence services and protective agencies in every democratic country use to justify the boundaries they draw between what the public knows and what it doesn't. But there is another argument. It surfaces in Dutch political commentary, in academic work on constitutional accountability, and more insistently in public discourse, since Amalia's own words made the scope of the situation impossible to minimize. It goes like this. Catharina-Amalia is not a private person. She is a constitutional figure. The relationship between the Dutch people and their monarchy is not merely cultural. It is civic, legal, and reciprocal. The crown exists because the Dutch constitutional order places it there, and that same order creates a degree of accountability between the institution and the citizens who sustain it. When the person designated to represent the future of that institution is effectively removed from the country by criminal threats that the state cannot neutralize, that is not simply a security matter. It is a democratic one. The public, in this argument, had a right not to operational intelligence, but to the basic fact that the heir to the throne had been driven out of the Netherlands by forces the Dutch state had not found a way to stop. Neither position has resolved the argument. What they have produced instead is an unresolved tension that sits inside the Dutch relationship with the monarchy, and that the phased disclosure of the last several years has made harder, not easier, to set aside. There is a further dimension that the debate rarely reaches. The palace had spent considerable institutional effort constructing a specific narrative around Catharina-Amalia. Accessible, grounded, civic-minded, choosing proximity to ordinary Dutch life over the distance that power usually creates. That narrative was not invented. It was, to a meaningful degree, true. But the more carefully it had been built, the more deliberately the palace had offered the Dutch public that version of their future queen, the more the gap created by her absence became impossible to explain away. The crown had promised the Dutch people one kind of princess. And then, in order to keep her alive, it had to become something she was not permitted to be. That is not an institutional failure. It is an institutional paradox. And paradoxes do not resolve, they accumulate. There is a version of this story that ends forward. By the spring of 2026, Catharina-Amalia had resumed a more visible public role. She had appeared alongside her parents at official events. She had given interviews. She had been photographed in the Netherlands again, in public, in the way that signals to a country that its future queen is still present and still moving. The court in The Hague is continuing its work. The broader criminal networks that generated the original threat remain an ongoing concern for Dutch law enforcement, an open wound in Dutch society that has not yet found a way to close, and that is beyond the power of any royal family to resolve. And Catharina-Amalia, now 22, is still studying, still on the path toward a throne she did not choose and cannot decline. But something happened in those 3 years that cannot be fully recovered. She will know in the specific embodied way that people who have lived through a particular kind of fear always know what it costs to have your name in someone else's notes beside a word for bloodbath. She will know what it is to look at a window and understand that going through it is not available to you. She will know what it means to attend your own university education through a laptop screen in a foreign city while your classmates walk to lectures in a country that could not promise to keep you safe. These are not wounds that appear in official photographs. They are not the kind of thing that press secretaries schedule away or that institutional statements absorb. There is a number, 2021, 2022, 2023, that represents time that cannot be returned. Not the dates themselves, but what those dates were supposed to contain, the years in which a person who has been assigned an enormous public role gets to discover, however briefly, who they are without it. That is what was taken. Not the crown, not the title, not the constitutional future. Those remain intact, preserved by institutions and security services, and the determined management of a family operating under conditions most families are never asked to imagine. What was taken were the years in which she was supposed to figure out something smaller and more essential than all of that: who she was, what she cared about, what it felt like to walk down a street in the country she was born to lead, not as its future queen, but simply as a person in it. Queen Maxima's words are the ones that stay. She said her daughter could not leave the house. She said it without diplomatic softening, in front of journalists, as a fact, a mother describing what had been done, not what had been protected, not what had been managed, what had been done. Catharina-Amalia was born on the 7th of December, 2003. She will one day be the Queen of the Netherlands. She will carry the crown across decades that none of us can fully see from here. But somewhere in Amsterdam, there is a staircase she climbed once, carrying a box at the beginning of something. She never got to go back. If the stories beneath the official version are the ones that stay with you, subscribe, and turn on notifications, there are more of them. The crown has more to answer for than the headlines ever say.